Welcome to the Mindful Marketplace. Welcome. So good to have you all back. Really grateful for the time that we get to spend together here today. If this is your first time with us on this program, we talk to the entrepreneurs, advisors, industry leaders, investors, economic experts who are really questioning the assumption that there's just one bottom line. It's where we learn how to connect our money and businesses to our values, our community, and ourselves. My name is Joel Skene with Biz Radio US, and today I'll be talking with Jenny Everett and Mark Clayton with the Research Cluster on Employee Ownership and Workplace Democracy to talk about the issue of ownership and legacy in business. But first, we got to hit the balance sheet, the assets, liabilities, debts, and investments. All right, in the assets column, I want to talk a little bit about a relevant topic for our guest today, but I want to talk a little bit about the growth of employee ownership, specifically by the focus that's being put on it by private equity, which we don't normally think of those two things as linked. But Blackstone, the world's largest alternative asset manager, is launching an equity-linked incentive program that will impact about 18,000 employees at a climate technology company. And so the move by Blackstone reflects a broader trend within private equity industry where companies are increasingly exploring ways to extend equity to their workforce. This trend has gained traction as private equity's role in society has expanded, more and more leading to increased scrutiny on how private equity treats and retains its employees. Other private equity firms like KKR that we've talked about here have also embraced the practice of extending equity to workers as a means to boost morale and address potential unrest within their workforces. Over $1 million in assets under management, Blackstone has, or I'm sorry, a trillion, not a million. My goodness, couldn't be more different. With over $1 trillion in assets under management, Blackstone's global investment strategies encompass various sectors, including, real estate, private equity, infrastructure, life sciences, credit, real estate, hedge funds. So it'll be really interesting to see how that growth develops. All right, next I want to hit in the liabilities column. I want to talk about the tech monopolies. So new research found that that tech workers could have actually earned an additional $5 billion in annual returns if their employees had pulled their retirement plan holdings out of the fossil fuel industry decades ago. So Google employees, for example, alone, turns out they lost out on over $1 billion in gains. The big tech companies have substantial 401k investment in fossil fuels, primarily through target date funds, with Google employees believed to have roughly $2 billion in fossil fuels and Apple employees another billion. The article on this also suggests that switching default options to sustainable funds and divesting from fossil fuel companies align with the company's stated sustainability goals and would protect employees from climate-related financial risk while bettering the investment returns for retirements of their workers. The 12 tech companies involved in this that were mentioned in the article, it says that they have yet to offer any response to these findings. All right, next in the debts column. So I want to talk about how the White House just announced yesterday the announcement, the cancellation of $7.7 billion in student debt for about 160,000 borrowers. So this brings the total number of people who have benefited from any debt relief push to about 4.75 million. And the beneficiaries for this plan include those who had enrolled in what's called the Savings on Valuable Education Repayment Plan. So they had already been doing earlier income-driven plans, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. The total debt relief approved by the White House now stands at about $167 billion. The issue of student loans and debt repayments remains high on the agenda for younger voters. And, the Biden administration continues to work on providing relief to those borrowers as he struggles to win the youth support. The relief is targeted specifically at individuals who had enrolled in the specific repayment plans and the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. I also want to mention, obviously, too, here, in order to help combat the debt crisis, my financial services agency is offering listeners of the Mindful Marketplace a free debt elimination report through our debt-free life service. It's education on the different strategies on how to pay off debt and a personalized report that shows how you could eliminate your debt in 9 years or less without spending any additional money. So check that out. Go to Mindful Marketplace Show or SkeneFinancial.com to check out the Debt Free Life program and get your free report. Lastly, in the investments column, I want to talk about this article in Investopedia that talks about how crowdfunding could actually be a new path for investors. We often talk about local investing on this show, and Michael Schuman recently wrote in the Main Street Journal about how we shouldn't, neglect real estate as a local investment option, and a way to invest your money that's not on Wall Street, not with any of the big companies, but in your local community. Businesses in your local community are usually what people think of when we think of local investing, but those businesses need to live somewhere and they need to live in real estate. There's a lot of advantages and obviously some disadvantages to doing real estate investing versus others, but this new way of doing it through crowdfunding really lowers the barrier to entry so that people who normally wouldn't have enough money to actually purchase a piece of real estate can buy a share in that real estate, allowing them to invest more locally. So check out the Investopedia article called Real Estate and Crowdfunding, A New Path for Investors, if you find that interesting as a way to get started in your local investment journey. All right, that is the balance sheet. I'm really excited to get to talk to Mark Hand and Jenny Everett today. I got to meet Jenny at the recent Neighborhood Economics Conference, and we really connected there. And she told me about some work that her and Mark are doing that I really wanted to get into. And so, Jenny, thanks so much for joining us here. I'll start with you today. I just talked about how employee ownership is gaining some traction in private equity. We've seen that all over the place. And your guys' work really revolves around some of these issues. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about why you think this is becoming something that we're seeing more and more in the news now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it certainly feels like there's a moment right now in the shared ownership space. And Mark and I sometimes talk about is that confirmation bias because we're now looking at these issues and the people that we follow are as well, or is there a broader interest? But I've seen a lot of new actors coming into this space, including myself. I've only been working in this area for about the past year and a half. And I think it's driven by a variety of different factors. I mean, first and foremost is the continual issues that we are facing as a community, whether it's around the increased wealth divide, increased wealth, racial inequity, climate change. So much of this is perpetuated by the way that assets are owned in not just in the United States, but globally, and how that differentiates between what people do and do not have. So I think, there's an increased awareness and desire to change that, and a lot of new actors who are maybe discovering for the first time this idea of shared ownership. I mean, employee ownership has been around for a long time, and some of the more traditional structures of ESOPs and co-ops. We'll talk a little bit about a newer structure that we're excited about, but I've seen a lot of actors from the philanthropic sector, the impact investing sector, who are now coming into this space. And that's where my background is. I've spent most of my work in kind of the broader social enterprise impact investing space. And when I first started looking at the shared ownership space, it really just resonated with a lot of the issues that I was interested in. I mean, some of the ones I've already mentioned, and a lot of the strategies that I was familiar with around place based investing or impact investing, but as a different tool for going about that. And I think that's why we're seeing more people come into this. And it's one of the few issues right now that has bipartisan support. It's something that really resonates on both sides of the aisle, whether you're looking at it from kind of a liberal, progressive workers' rights standpoint or a more conservative, Main Street, shoring up local business perspective. It's a model that sort of both sides of the aisle can get behind. And then you also have a moment in time. We are facing what's called the silver tsunami, where a large portion of businesses in the US right now are owned by baby boomers who are looking to retire, and many of them don't have a succession plan. They don't have children who want to take over their business. And so, if they're lucky, they might get acquired, they might be acquired by private equity. You could argue whether or not that's a good thing for the business, but that's not going to happen for a lot of businesses. And so they need to figure out another way to keep the doors open if they want their company and their legacy to survive. So increasingly, business owners are looking for new avenues, and employee ownership provides a really interesting one for them, not only to make sure that their company continues on, but that they take care of their employees. So I think there's just a lot of factors. And
Mm.
then, as you mentioned, at the top, you have actors like private equity who are coming into this, and the work that Pete Stavros has been doing with Ownership America, and now Blackstone's coming in. And there are some naysayers and some skepticism around that, and others are excited that this is just bringing more energy and excitement around the field. I think it remains to be seen what are going to be the most effective strategies, but really encouraging all the energy that's going into this.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been seeing it more and more. Mark, I'm curious for you, how did you find your way into doing this kind of work, and why has it been important with you to, partner up with Jenny here?
Joel, thanks for having us. I'm really happy to be here. And I think one of the things that struck me and that I thought about as Jenny was talking is that the I think part of the reason that this work is getting more interest is in part that it's at the confluence of a number of different um, things that are happening. And so the labor market's really tight, which means that owners are looking around for ways to retain and attract talent. I think that philanthropists are beginning to understand that a lot of the ways that companies have traditionally been run and managed serves to further accumulate wealth in a smaller number of hands. And so, if part of what we want to do is address income inequality, then we might need to take a look at who owns assets. And
Mm.
so there are a ton of different rivers that are sort of coming together, streams that are coming together into this larger river of interest in alternative forms of ownership. And the thing that got me interested in this work was a conversation with my friend Zoe Schlag, who runs a group called Common Trust that invests in companies looking to convert to employee ownership trusts. And when she and I were talking about it, I got interested in this new structure, which I thought was interesting. So as an academic, as somebody that whose job it is to do research, I got curious about this new organizational structure that seemed to be growing and emerging. But then, as a political scientist, I also got interested in this question of when you start to change how companies are owned, then you might also change how they are governed and managed. And it might be that if you become, well, certainly if you become a worker cooperative, then the way the company is managed will change. If you become an ESOP owned company, then it might be that some of the management has to change. It might be that it has to become more democratic. And so that's one of my real areas of interest here is what does it look like to build democratic muscles and habits inside of organizations, inside of the places that we work. And then as a political scientist, part of what I'm curious about is if we make workplaces more democratic, then does that help us build the skills and muscles that we might need in order to participate more effectively in democracy as writ large, in political
Mm.
democracy? And I think that it's fair to say that many Americans might look around right now and feel like maybe some of our democratic muscles aren't as well developed, aren't as strong as they used to be. And so perhaps our workplaces and the organizations that we're a part of can be places where we can start to get in some reps at managing things more democratically.
Yeah, there's several ways that this can be done that I want to get into on the second half of our conversation here. This will be a two-part conversation for everyone listening. But I guess what I want to start with is what is the end result? There must be some reason, some sort of effect that you've seen that has inspired you to do this work. I'm curious either of your perspectives on that.
I'm happy to jump in there because I think that in and of itself, that question in and of itself speaks to all of the fascinating complexity in this area. And so the most well-researched version of shared ownership is employee stock ownership plans or ESOPs. And in companies that are run by or that convert into being an ESOP, the outcomes are great, especially to the degree that you involve employees in the participation in the management of that company. And so they build wealth. The companies are more resilient. They tend to grow more quickly. The employees report being happier at work, and so there's this whole potpourri of benefits that brings. And I think that one of the most important ones there is that it helps those employees build long-term assets, because that's where generational wealth can start to come from. It's not from wages, but from assets. And then on the other side, I think that there are benefits to participating as an owner in the place that you work.
Oh
in
yeah.
terms of your own sense of self-efficacy. And then maybe there are these spillover effects, which is that if you learn how to handle conflict at work, maybe you get a little bit better at handling conflict at home or in your neighborhood or in your community.
Yeah, it reminds me about a year and a half ago, I had on a guy who was an executive coach, business coach, but really people-oriented gentleman. And his name's Drew McClure, great guy. And he talked about how with his coaching business, they actually encourage the executives to look at their employees as the people they need to be investing in most, because they said if you invest in your people, you eventually are investing in your profits, even though some business owners try to skip that, right? Yeah, I'm curious, Jenny, do you have anything to add on that, on the effects that you've seen?
Yeah, I was just going to add, well, I think in addition to the research that exists, and as Mark mentioned, there's a lot of evidence out there about the, increased success of businesses that convert to employee ownership, but there's a lot we still don't know and that needs to be researched. So the things that really interest me understanding over the long term is, for example, if employees are part of a company that has a profit sharing mechanism, and so they are sharing in the profits annually and then reinvesting that in their community because they're buying homes or they're getting more involved in their local
Mm,
schools. What does that look like? What's that knock-on effect? How does this affect groups in different races or across genders or different abilities? There's a lot of nuance that as more companies go to these models and we have more data, we can really get into. I think there's a lot of hope and promise around this, but some of it still remains to be seen. But I think it's a really interesting piece of this.
Well, and I like what you mentioned earlier about the bipartisan nature of this. It really is. I noticed both. It's one of the few things I was talking to. I had Marjorie Kelly on, and she said that this was one of the few ideas that was supported both by Ronald Reagan and by Bernie Sanders. And you don't usually see those two names next to each other.
Yeah,
We've got
Mark and I were just at the
yeah.
Aspen Institute conference at Aspen Institute and Rutgers University conference on employee ownership, and we had a day at the Capitol, and it was exactly that. We had, several congressmen from the Republican side coming in and talking to us, and at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders came in and told us we were all revolutionaries for the work that we were doing. So.
I love it. Um, With a few minutes that we've got left, I think another reason why this is becoming such a topic of conversation is this idea of the silver tsunami. I wonder if either of you could just jump in on why it is that a business owner who's retiring, ready to kind of hang up their business, why they are really kind of a high priority or most likely to consider some sort of conversion to employee ownership, because there's so many of them happening right now.
Yeah, and this is a little bit what I was talking about at the beginning of our conversation. It's, part of it is reality that they don't necessarily have another alternative. If they don't have a family member who wants to take over their business, they don't have somebody to sell it to, you know, if they can't find an alternative, they're going to have to close their business. And for people who've spent their whole lives building up a company and, being part of the local community, they need different alternatives. And so are starting increasingly to look to employee ownership. Traditionally in the form of ESOPs, but ESOPs really only work for companies of a certain size because ESOPs are ERISA regulated. They can be quite expensive and quite complicated to do. And that's one of the reasons that Mark and I are really excited about this newer model around perpetual purpose trusts and employee ownership trusts that I think we'll get into, because it has the potential to be a much more scalable option, or at least an option for the companies that, just for whatever reason, ESOPs might not be the right avenue or co-ops might not be the right avenue.
Yeah. Mark, anything on that?
Yeah, I would say so. There's a practical consideration here, which is that as baby boomers retire, most of them will have no option, and so many of these businesses that exist and that are often pillars of local communities will just close, and that is one of the primary things that we're at the very beginning of right now. That I think is driving a lot of the interest in some of these alternative ownership models is what does succession and legacy look like for those business owners? Well, that's the pragmatic version. I think the philosophical thing here is that many of these owners of small and medium sized businesses, they have never been in it just to make money. They've been
Mm.
making money in order to support their families, in order to build up their communities. They're often the folks that sponsor little leagues and donate to local causes and churches and are leaders in some of those organizations. And so what we often see is that when owners are presented with another option other than just cash out, that they're very hungry for that option. Even the ones that could sell to private equity. Had one owner tell me that he saw friends sell to private equity, and he left with a fat wallet and a broken heart, because he
Mm.
then was going in the grocery stores where he would see the spouses of the people who then got hired by the private equity firms that had purchased his company. And had he known there was another path available, then he might have even taken a haircut on the sale to ensure that the company that he had spent his entire career building, and cared about, could stay open and continue contributing to that community. So I think they're both the practical considerations, just
Mhm.
the raw facts that a lot of these businesses will close. In addition to the fact that some of these alternatives actually line up a lot better with the way that small and medium business owners think about their companies.
Yeah, I spend a good amount of time in sort of entrepreneurial, meetups and startup communities and, kind of getting around the people who are, trying to do something. It's always fun and energizing for me. But I have noticed that one of the main reasons that people do get into business for themselves, a lot of it's because they don't like having a job or a boss. That's a big one. But another one is to really leave a legacy, to leave to make a lasting impact. And you're right, if you end up just selling your business after all those decades to a machine basically that's going to just churn out profit from it, that doesn't really feel like a legacy in the same way that leaving a community institution where your people are taken care of and where they now get to carry on that torch for you does. So I'm really excited. In part two, we're going to dig into like, how does this work? What are these perpetual trusts? Why is democracy in the workplace important? So we got a lot we could talk about in 20 minutes, but join us next week, same time here on Tuesdays, and make sure to subscribe on, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to check out the work that these folks are doing here. Where's the website that they can follow you guys at?
They
At
can check us out at
yeah, at eowd.com.
All right. Well, join us next time. And until then, remember, we are each other.
Hey Joel.
All right. Welcome back to the second half of a really fascinating and energizing conversation I've been having here with Mark Hand and Jenny Everett, who work together with the Research Cluster on Employee Ownership and Workplace Democracy. If you didn't hear the first half of this episode, go back and take a listen to that, because both Mark and Jenny really got to share a lot of great information on the overview of kind of what is employee ownership and why is it something that's being talked about more and more right now. And we also got into why business owners who are, hitting the retirement age may want to consider employee ownership as the best model to leave a legacy in their business. So we're going to pick back up here. Jenny and Mark, thanks so much for your time today. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Glad to be
Great to be
back.
here.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we ended by kind of talking about, there's all of these business owners who are hitting that retirement age. They've spent decades building a business. Maybe it's big, maybe it's small, but they built a business. They want to leave a legacy with that business, and they're considering alternative options rather than just letting some company bigger than them buy them, or maybe passing it on to kids who maybe want the business, maybe don't want the business, right? And so I guess where I'd like to start is by actually talking about how does this actually work? If someone wanted to hypothetically have a business that wasn't just owned by one person, but that had some sort of worker ownership involved or some kind of equity stake for their people, what are the models that have already been used and who's used them?
I'm happy to jump in there. Yeah. So before we get to employee ownership trusts and perpetual purpose trusts, which we're particularly excited about, I think it's worth just a quick overview of some of the options that are out there. Your listeners are probably most familiar with employee stock options, which are the sort of things that you might get if you work at a startup. And then in addition to those, there's something called the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, or ESOP. And that's basically a retirement account that your employer contributes to and then holds in trust on your behalf. And those, there are about 6,000 of those across the country, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 of those. Here in Texas, one of the big grocery stores, Brookshire's, has one of these models, and Bob's General Mill has an ESOP
Oh yeah.
program. There's a pizza company in Louisiana called Johnny's, who has the
They
slogan,
make the
"Everybody gets a slice of the pie."
flour and
That's right,
grains and
Bob's
stuff.
Flour
Yeah,
Mill.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
Bob's Red
And
Mill.
then that's right. That's it. That's the one. Sorry. And then the less common but still powerful one is a worker cooperative, where a company is owned by its members, which are its employees. So there's a brewery in Austin, for example, that's called the Black Star Co-op. Your listeners have probably heard of. And the idea is that every member or worker there gets one option, one vote. And there's somewhere between 750 and 1,000 of those across the country. And so that's the lay of the land. And part of what Jenny and I are interested in is a form of ownership that's called purpose trust ownership. And the idea is that you would put a company inside of a trust, which is then tasked with making sure that a company runs according to its mission. So if you take the case of a company here in Texas called ACP International, they make road signs. And if you ever see one of those little, the sort of things sticking out of the ground that tell you that there's a Wi-Fi cable underneath, they generate those. It's a manufacturing company. And when the owner, Joe Nussbaum, began to think about retirement, he chose a trust. And so now ACP International is controlled by a trust. And that trust says from now on, ACP International has to be run to the benefit of its employees. And then over time, the ownership, the financial ownership of the company will transition from Joe to the trust, and ACP will continue to be able to operate on its own, owned by that trust to the benefit of the employees. Patagonia is probably the most famous example of a company that is using this. Instead of benefiting its employees, the Patagonia Purpose Trust now has as its mission, as its purpose, to benefit the planet. And it controls the company, Patagonia, ensuring that it is operating to that mission. So there's a couple of examples, one big, one small, one that's focused on the planet, one that's focused on its employees.
So in either way, essentially a trust is created that then owns the company, and the trust has the ultimate control to say what the purpose is, that then the company can try to fulfill that purpose. So it's kind of like a reorganizing of priorities, if I kind of understand it, where profit still matters because obviously you can't do business if you don't stay in business, but that maximizing profit may not be the number one priority of the trust. Rather, either the benefit of the workers is the purpose of the trust, or the planet, or whatever whoever designs the trust can set as the primary purpose, that the business has to serve that purpose. Am I understanding that right? Yeah.
You
That's
got it.
that's Oh, go
If
ahead.
I give one more example that might line this up, and there's a company in Oregon called Organically Grown Company, and when they set up their purpose trust, they decided that they wanted to use the trust to ensure that they could balance the different goals that they have. And so on the trust committee, that then gives direction to the board, that committee is tasked with benefiting their employees, making sure that their growers of food benefit from the work that they're doing, their distributors, then also their investors. And so the job of the trust is to make sure that in addition to making money, that each of those stakeholders benefits from the way that the company is run.
Yeah. Yeah, I also want to understand too, because it sounds like this is the way that it's been done before. But you mentioned that it's something that has only really been, for the most part, accessible to pretty large companies. Like, if you're Patagonia, you may be able to do this, but it may be harder for the local fleece maker in your town, if you have one, to do that, right? So tell us a little bit about the changes and innovations that are happening in these trusts. I know you guys are specifically excited about. You said it's a purpose trust. Is that the name of it?
That's right. So legally speaking, these are non-charitable purpose trusts without an ascertainable beneficiary. Now that's a mouthful, but the change is that in some states, you are now allowed to have a trust that owns a company in perpetuity that doesn't designate a specific beneficiary, like, say, your kid, if you had a trust fund, or your pet. It can have a class of people like your employees or your other stakeholders as the beneficiary of the trust. And that shift that has taken place over the course of the last 20 years or so is the thing that has started to enable this. And so it is, it's whereas ESOPs tend to work best for larger companies because of the cost of setting them up and maintaining them. An employee ownership trust that might cost $30,000 to $60,000 to set up is much more available to a much wider swath of companies in the United States.
I guess what
And
would be
that's
the biggest? Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
Oh, I was just that's part of the reason we're excited about these structures is we think they have a real potential to fill this need. And, you know, we were talking in the earlier part about the silver tsunami. We have all these companies that could consider employee ownership, but an ESOP structure or co-op structure just might not be right for them for, you know, various reasons. And so could these new trust structures be a solution that could really scale and fill that niche?
Are there certain kinds of businesses that, like, let's say we've got three different businesses that all have interest in being some kind of employee ownership, moving forward. But which kind of businesses would be good for an ESOP? Which kind of businesses would be good for an employee trust? And then which kind of businesses? I'm curious because you mentioned the breweries. We have a brewery here in Asheville that's also a worker-owned co-op. So I'm kind of wondering, like, are breweries really good for this, or like, which kind of companies does it make most sense to be either an ESOP, a employee trust, or actually be a worker-owned co-op?
So I think that you're stepping right into one of the questions that this industry is asking right now. And the way that I think about it is that in part, it depends on the characteristics of the business and then on what it is that the owner is optimizing for. And so with a worker cooperative, if you're interested in that, what it means is that you're committing yourself to that one person, one vote decision-making structure. So it's
Right.
maximally democratic. And that may work really well for some companies. And so if you are let's say a group of lawyers, you might be interested in a co-op structure. There's a partnership structure, but maybe you could use a co-op structure too. And then if you're trying to set up an ESOP, part of what you might be prioritizing there is setting up retirement assets for your employees and maintaining the flexibility to then sell to another company in a way that would maximize their retirement accounts. And so ESOPs are often really about building assets for individuals. They tend to be a little bit bigger because of the cost of setting them up, but really the motivator there is building assets. And then employee ownership trusts or perpetual purpose trusts, people tend to be drawn towards them because of their flexibility. And so there isn't a sort of size requirement there or an optimal size. A lot of the companies that we see are going to be between 20 and 100 employees or something like that. But I think that's just because of the companies that have initially been drawn to it. But there are much larger ones like Patagonia and maybe even Hobby Lobby. I haven't been able to confirm. And then the other way that the flexibility attracts owners is that you can choose how much you're going to change your management structure separately from the conversion to the trust. And so there's some employee ownership trusts that we've encountered, like Bicycle Technologies International in New Mexico, and at least out of the gate, as they converted to an employee ownership trust, the way that the company is managed hasn't changed very much. And then as the owner then transitions out, then more and more of the management will be transitioned to those employees. And so the flexibility of the trust structure seems to be the thing that owners really get attracted to.
Yeah. The one other thing I would add to this, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, is one of the reasons that business owners might choose a perpetual purpose trust is that ability to lock in the purpose, which a co-op and an ESOP don't really have that mechanism. So those are really good options for companies that are primarily interested in the employee piece. But if they have another aspect to their business that they want to preserve into perpetuity, the purpose trust allows them to do that.
Right. Maybe they care about a particular part of their town or a neighborhood in their town that's been
Exactly.
disenfranchised. Maybe they care a lot about the environment, like in the case of Patagonia.
Yeah. Or the
they can.
suppliers that they're sourcing from, or exactly.
Right. No, that makes a ton of sense. You mentioned earlier you mentioned how you feel like this model of the employee trust is really scalable, and you've also mentioned the flexibility. Is the scalability due to that flexibility, or is there more to it than that?
I think it's a good question. I mean, the flexibility right now is probably both a bit of a blessing and a curse because these tools are so new and we don't have a lot of standardization and templates. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing on the field building piece is figuring out, what do the various actors that are working to help businesses convert, what are they learning from best practices? What are we looking at research wise to maybe start to standardize to a certain degree, and that gets into policy considerations as well. Part of the scalability, and Mark mentioned this, is it's just a more affordable option. Because ESOPs are ERISA regulated, there's a lot of regulation and a lot that goes around, complying with that regulation. And so for companies, some smaller companies, it just might not make sense. And again, because this is a newer space, there's, only 50 or so companies in the country right now that have done this, but they're getting faster to do as well. So it may be a more expedient option for owners who, would like to convert sooner rather than later. So those are some of the reasons we think it
Yeah.
could scale, but early days still.
Well, and I'm also curious too, just thinking out loud here a little bit about could a perpetual purpose trust be put together not just by a company, but could, some other type of community organization, whether it's a church or a neighborhood or a social co-op or, anything like that. Do you see potential for this to become a tool for impact investing that people can do collectively?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some great examples around the country of groups that are doing neighborhood trusts, which again are based on the same kind of legal structure, but focused on property or community at a neighborhood level versus a single company.
Yeah, that'd be so cool if your neighborhood had a trust that you guys could all get together and vote and say, hey, we want to build a playground here, or we want to, do these other things with. I think that's a really innovative thing. Mark, I see you're getting excited. You have something to say there?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm just always excited about this stuff, I think. But one example that I think your listeners could look at is the Kensington Corridor Trust in Philadelphia. It's one of the groups that is experimenting with how it is that we might use this structure in order not just to house corporate assets, but to house real estate assets and set them to a particular purpose.
Yeah. I'm also curious from you, Mark, too, because I know that when it comes to democratic workplaces, you kind of have a deeper background in this stuff because you actually kind of teach it at the university. Which school is it in Texas? There, I apologize, I forgot already.
You're good. I'm at the University of Texas at Arlington.
You just
which,
lost
like a
all
lot of
your
things in
Texas
Texas,
listeners, but
Man.
that's okay.
University of Texas,
That's right.
Arlington.
The University of Texas at
UT,
Arlington. It's great. Come and see
Texas
it.
Tech. I know about Rice. That's in Texas. I got a friend who went
Yes,
to
yeah,
Rice.
that's right. That's right. That's right. There are a lot of good universities down here. Come and see us. So I teach a course on democratic theory, and one of the things that I do with my students is I introduce them to the idea that the principles that we might want to follow in the way that we govern ourselves might also be principles that we want to follow in the workplace. And so when we think about the ability to speak your mind, the ability to know what is happening that in the decision-making rooms that might affect you, that all of these things are things that in the governmental space we've kind of worked out, but in the corporate space, they're still pretty fringe and still pretty niche. And so one of the things that I have my students do is I have them pick an organization that they're a part of or that they would like to be a part of, and then go see how democratic it is. Or how hierarchical it is. So is the company that they work for more like an autocracy or more like a democracy? And you can see students as they begin to think about this, they start to get nervous. And as they go out and have conversations with, say, the places that they work, they realize that when they ask these questions, that they're now stumbling into these unspoken questions of power. And so for me as a political scientist, that's part of what I'm interested in, is how it is that power is distributed. And despite the fact that our political philosophers have helped us figure out how to move away from kingdoms many hundreds of years ago and build another option that works, we're still at the very beginning of companies beginning to look at themselves and say, does this have to be a kingdom? Does this have to be an authoritarian structure? Or is there another way? And so there's some groups that have started to figure this out. One of the most obvious and accessible is something called the Great Game of Management, where companies begin to open up their books, their financial statements to employees. And that's a risky thing to do because it exposes where power lies. But there are organizations that help companies walk through how it is that we can take that step towards what I, as a political scientist, might call a more democratic form of management.
That question that you have about power and ownership, it seems like those two things are pretty uniquely connected, and I imagine that's why those students are making that question. I've never done that type of exercise, like actually thought through, hey, is this group that I'm in, do they operate more like a democracy, or is it more like a theocracy, or more like a dictatorship? Who knows, right? And
Sure.
I
And
do,
in almost
it's,
any organization,
mhm.
I was saying, in almost any organization, you could say, are there places where we could share information more widely and effectively?
Mm.
Are there places where there are big decisions being made that affect a lot of people, where we could figure out ways to incorporate more of the people affected by that decision into the making of that decision? And there's sort of those baby steps that you can take
Mhm.
towards a less hierarchical, more democratic workplace.
Right, because there are other ways to move in this direction that doesn't even involve such a huge, like a huge shift to a different ownership model. Like some companies just make sure that their employees have representation on the board. Some companies just like they make sure to include all the different stakeholders in or as many as they can, or are expanding to. Um, and so there's ways to get at this in this direction. I think I like the way you described it, because it puts it in a perspective of like a spectrum, that there are, a worker-owned co-op may be way off to one side of like total democratic ownership, but that there are these other ways that you can actually start to move in that direction if you're an entrepreneur or a business owner, like that. I've got a couple minutes left, and I just kind of want to end with something, Jenny, you were talking about at the beginning or in the first half, which is about the kind of bipartisan support of this. In some ways, this does feel kind of radical. It does feel like a completely radical and different way of doing business. But in other ways, it seems like it's just a natural kind of progression of, as you said, moving from kingdoms to, business owners, and, kind of having the ownership lie there, and then moving to the actual workers and the people. But I'm curious your perspective on why you think it resonates across the board in a world where most things are very divided that have to do with business or the economy.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable. It's one of the few areas where there's some consensus, though maybe for different reasons, right? So, on the progressive side, I think it's more again about worker rights. It's about wealth inequality. It's about shifting of assets. Those are the types of issues that people care about, that this resonates with. On the more conservative side, it's about securing Main Street. It's about keeping businesses local, particularly in rural communities that can be really effective if, one of their Main Street companies goes out of business or is purchased by private equity and then sold off. Job security, job creation, that kind of thing. So it just really touches on a lot of issues that are cross-cutting. And so it's been interesting to see, even in this current administration, where Congress is coming together and passing legislation and being proactive around this in a way that we're not seeing across most other issues.
Yeah, I love to see it. Mark, any other final thoughts on that before we head out?
Um, no, I think Jenny covered it really well. Very grateful to be here, Joel.
Well, I'm really grateful for the work that you all are doing. Can you once again say the name of the blog that you guys have, where you're publishing everything here, and where people can find you to learn more about how they can, how they can make their workplace more democratic?
Happy to. So we've got a weekly newsletter that we send out from the website eowd.org, which stands for Employee Ownership and Workplace Democracy. So that's eowd.org. And our weekly newsletter takes fewer than 6 minutes to read every week.
Awesome. I'm going to subscribe right now, and we're going to put that website in the show notes for everybody so they can get there. Make sure to subscribe on all the different platforms, that wherever you get your podcast, whether it's YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Buzzsprout, and make sure to subscribe, leave us a like and a comment. And until next time, remember, we are each other.